During this session, we will hear from 2 presenters and 1 discussant. There is a change in the program, and I will tell you in a couple of minutes about it. Now, before getting to the presentations, let me remind you of the session protocol and etiquette. All attendees, except the person currently speaking, must remain muted. Presentations last 20 minutes. The session host will prompt the presenter when there are 2 minutes left. When 20 minutes have elapsed, the session host will prompt again, and I will move to the discussion period. The discussion periods last 10 minutes and immediately follow each presentation. Listeners, please enter their questions, comments to everyone in the chat box. I will accept questions in the order received, read the listener's name and question aloud, and then allow the presenter to respond verbally. Following each presentation, there is going to be a 2-minute transition period to allow the next presenter to prepare for their presentation. The discussant, we have a discussant today, has 30 minutes to discuss the papers presented. Our first speaker in the program, Constanza Valdez from the Economic Research Service of the US Department of Agriculture, is not able to present today. So we will start with Erika Bethman from the US International Trade Commission. Erika will discuss the implications of the EU-Mercosur Agreement on trade competitiveness. Erika, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Marina. So as Marina said, I'm also from the International Trade Commission, US International Trade Commission, and I'm going to be presenting my current research, preliminary research on the EU-Mercosur FTA, its impacts on member countries and the United States. And I can't see the participant list, but I believe my co-author, also from USITC, might be joining, Fernando Gracia. And the standard disclaimer applies that material presented in this slide deck does not represent the views of the Commission or any of its individual commissioners. I'll begin with a background on the EU-Mercosur FTA and a trade overview of the major partners. Then I'll go into my specific research objective, some literature review on this agreement, the particular analytical approach and details of it that I take, and then finally end with some preliminary results and some notes about ongoing work. So as background, the EU-Mercosur FTA negotiations began in 2000, right around when Mercosur was established as a trade bloc. And over the past 20 years, they've been, negotiations have been suspended and relaunched multiple times, finally reaching a political agreement in 2019. However, despite this political agreement, all of the individual parliaments of the EU and Mercosur member countries have to ratify the agreement before it goes into force. And that's currently the stumbling block that they're facing. But kind of part of the reason why there's been such a resurgence in scholarly interest in this agreement as of late, especially given that the agreement would cover a market of about 780 million people, about 10% of the global population, and encompasses about 25% of world GDP. As you can see from the graph on the right, the EU has consistently been a larger and more significant trade partner of Mercosur than the US, accounting for about 30% of its total imports and exports from 2017 to 2019. And in terms of trade competition, if you take a look at the right-hand side of the slide, between the US and the EU, the top exports to Mercosur are all seem to be industrial goods, whereas the top Mercosur exports to the US are industrial goods, and the top exports to the EU are concentrated in agri-food and crops. And I highlighted some of the sectors where the EU and US seem to be competing in some of the same sectors. Again, these are industrial sectors, chemical products, pharmaceuticals, and the like. Conversely, when you look at EU trade with the US and Mercosur, you'll notice that the current dynamic is much more imbalanced. If you take a look at the graph on the right, you can see that Mercosur makes up just about 2% of total EU exports and imports over the same time period. And at the sector level on the right, I've identified, again, some overlap in EU exports of industrial goods to the US and Mercosur. However, you can see that the associated market shares suggest that these are not necessarily in competition. The US far dominates Mercosur. In terms of the existing trade barriers between the EU and Mercosur, you can see from the shaded cells in red that Mercosur tariffs outpace EU tariffs overall and in the non-agricultural sector. And there's only one area in agriculture where that there is an exception. As we all know, the EU's agriculture sector is highly protected. And the story is pretty similar with TRQs, as you can see from the shaded cells. Mercosur countries continuously exceed their quota allotments. And essentially, I show these last two slides to suggest that both the EU in terms of tariff liberalization and Mercosur in terms of TRQs have a lot to gain from liberalization under this agreement. And given this backdrop, my research objective is to assess the impact of the 2019 EU-Mercosur FTA on trade, GDP, and welfare of the member countries in the US. And I highlight 2019 because it reinforces the fact that the agreement in its current form and context differs very significantly from what's been studied in the past. Contemporary analysis, as you'll see in the next couple slides on the literature review, benefits significantly from the increase in available information about the agreement, such as the published tariff elimination schedules, as well as the wealth of available data and methods regarding non-tariff measures, which are an increasingly important aspect of free trade agreements, and this one is no different. In terms of the existing literature on this agreement, past studies have used static CGE models to simulate the effects of full liberalization of tariffs only, finding overall positive but limited increases in real GDP and welfare that are well below 1%. And I've listed a few of them below. Conversely, contemporary models take a much more tailored approach by incorporating NTM reductions as productivity shocks and tariff liberalizations, either by presenting a range of estimates for both conservative and ambitious liberalization scenarios, such as was the case with the LSE Sustainability Impact Assessment, or by adapting the published preliminary tariff liberalization schedules themselves, such as work by Carrico et al. Did with the dynamic model that focused on farm level effects in the Dutch economy. Nevertheless, these contemporary models also find overall positive but muted GDP and welfare effects that favor Mercosur relative to the EU. Our particular analytical approach and what we think are our value added in this area begins with the data that we're using. We're using the standard comparative static GTAP model version 7. And for the underlying data, we're using the most current release of the GTAP database version 11 that has a 2017 baseline. It's the, as I said, the most updated set of data. And we've aggregated, we've kept the standard aggregation for the 65 sectors, but aggregated the regions to 42. And interestingly, these entail 37 single country regions, which include the individual EU and Mercosur member countries. So we use a regional mapping in GEMPAC to be able to look at effects of the shocks and the scenarios that we play out, both at the individual member country level, but also at the trade bloc level, which is something that's not necessarily common in the existing literature, at least for the EU. In terms of tariffs, we're working on adapting the actual preliminary ABE tariff reduction elimination schedules that were published in 2019 through a combination of trade-weighted and arithmetic ABEs. And while the EU TRQ offers are not included in that schedule explicitly, they're there has been publicized information about these TRQ levels and the product groupings that we've incorporated as well. Finally, in terms of NTMs, we incorporate technical and non-technical components of merchandise NTM ABEs with tailored reduction estimates that are based on a qualitative review of the agreement and some related literature. And we implement these reductions using the productivity method via the AMS variable. Wanted to dive a bit deeper into the approach that we're taking with modeling NTMs, because that is pretty much the highlight of this presentation, and the current specification and results are only related to the NTM part of this model. So as inputs, we use data on technical and non-technical NTM ABEs that's provided by the World Bank at the bilateral sector level for the key regions that we have in the model. And these estimates are based on UNCTAD trains data, policy data for technical NTMs and non-technical NTMs. And just as a refresher, technical NTMs focus more on SPS measures, conformity assessment, and the like, whereas non-technical NTMs focus more on quantitative restrictions, price controls, and other measures. And we take these technical and non-technical NTM ABEs, and they form cumulative base components of the overall AMS variable. So we are able to treat the technical and non-technical separately when we incorporate the shocks. And we do that by kind of having a qualitative discussion of the NTMs that are specifically mentioned in the agreement as they contribute to these tailored estimates of the NTM reductions at the bilateral and sector level. And again, these reductions in NTMs are computed as shocks to the power of AMS. And we follow conservative approaches in literature that suggest that cumulative reductions to sectoral NTM ABEs resulting from a given commitment or provision in the agreement don't exceed 20%. So in the current specification, the cumulative sectoral NTM ABEs are reduced proportionately by a maximum of 8% for technical NTMs and 17% for non-technical NTMs for a given sector, and those vary according to the trade block that they're being applied to and the given sector. And in going through the process of determining what the actual value of these reductions would be, since we're not using econometric estimates of these NTM ABEs, there is a little subjectivity that comes into it, but we've relied heavily on existing literature and principles that are mentioned therein. So low reductions in the NTM ABEs are reserved for the technical NTMs, and typically policies and provisions that require traveling more regulatory distance. So, fundamentally changing standards and procedures or harmonizing requirements to a more stringent level of policy, as is typically the case for Mercosur in this agreement. They're upgrading to the existing EU levels, which serve almost as a benchmark of the NTM policies in place. And then on the other hand, you have high reductions reserved for non-technical NTMs that require traveling less regulatory distance, such as applying existing rules to fewer products or having accepting non-reciprocal assessments or labeling from your trade partner. And I just wanted to walk through one example that we incorporate into the model of how we operationalize a provision in the agreement into related shocks. One technical NTM provision in the agreement concerns the mutual establishment of general conformity assessment principles between the EU and Mercosur that have the intended effect of reducing regulatory disharmony for both ag and non-ag sectors for both trade partners. However, Mercosur countries have far less uniformity and existing stringency in their current conformity assessment policies. So you can see on the right, we have the AMS shock, and sorry, this is written in kind of in shorthand, but the AMS shock applied to all sectors for EU exports to Mercosur is reduced by 4%. And because the Mercosur countries have necessarily more work to do in reaching these conformity assessment principles, the AMS shock for the same sectors of Mercosur imports to the EU is reduced by a lower value. And then furthermore, Mercosur is committed to accept test results by EU conformity assessment bodies in the electronics sector specifically. So we have an even higher reduction for that specific sector for EU imports into Mercosur, because they will necessarily face almost no barrier in terms of the conformity assessment policies. And then I wanted to just quickly highlight some of the sectors with the highest technical NTM levels, both in Mercosur and the EU. These are processed rice and crops, and then pretty much the same grouping of agri-food and some industrial sectors. And actually, I just wanted to highlight Brazil has an exceedingly high NTM for this sector that will come into play when we take a look at the results. And again, the same is true for EU NTMs in these sectors. And now to turn to some of the preliminary results of the NTM modeling. You can see that consistent with other studies, both Mercosur and the EU see small gains in real GDP and welfare, with Mercosur gaining relatively more than the EU. And I've also included significant third country trade partners like the US and China, which you can see decline across these key economy-wide sectors. And part of the value of this model is that we can dive deeper into the individual economies of these two trade blocs and find that Brazil and Argentina benefit largely of all of the Mercosur countries, whereas other major trade partners like Germany, France, Netherlands benefit the most out of all of the EU member countries. And as expected, the expansion in GDP largely tracks with the overall size of these economies, although there's the NTM reductions are treated, on a uniform level for the most part. Larger economies with more significant existing trade flows between the FTA partners stand to gain the most, which is exactly what you see here. And then diving deeper into trade between Mercosur and the EU, we can see that Mercosur exports to the EU increase at the expense of trade with its other major trading partners. And you'll remember from a few slides ago that many of the sectors that are highlighted on the right as the sectors that receive the largest increases in Mercosur exports to the EU. These sectors were among those with the highest technical NTMs, among both trade blocs. And specifically in the case of the processed rice sector, there were initially low trade values. So when you think about that as a whole, the initially low trade values combined with the a decent reduction in the extremely high NTM on this sector, you get these very large effects. And again, you see even at the sector level, the same trade diversion is present. And then with Mercosur imports, again, you can see the diversion in imports is more a function of decreases in intra-Mercosur trade than it is trade diversion to its other partners. And again, processed rice is a big winner in this in these results. And yeah, again, this is driven by the fact that the reduction in Mercosur NTMs facing EU exporters was even slightly higher than the reduction for Mercosur exports, or Mercosur exports to the exporters to the EU. So you see the relative increase in processed rice is higher for imports to Mercosur than it is.
Erica, you have 2 more minutes.
Okay, thank you. And then I have these next 2 slides on EU exports and imports, which are generally, the mirror view. But it's interesting that you can see there is relatively no trade diversion in both imports and exports, based on the fact that Mercosur makes up just 2% of overall EU trade. So that there's even a 2% increase in EU exports to Mercosur does not have an effect on a significant effect on trade with its other trade partners. And then finally, a note about ongoing work. I'm hoping to continue this research by updating the baseline with more recent macroeconomic trade and tariff data. There were some great presentations in yesterday's session on this topic that did just that, and I'd like to follow their lead. Similarly, with incorporating the finish incorporating the tariff and TRQ reductions into the model. And I'd also like to tailor the allocation of NTM ADUs across various tax and trade efficiency instruments. So in the current version of the model, I'm applying all NTMs as productivity shocks, but that's definitely not the case. You can think of an example like geographical indicators, which could actually be implemented more as a demand shift than a productivity gain. So that would be one example. And then I would also like to consider applying NTM reductions to selected third-party countries like the US and China, since those are part of the focus of the paper, where applicable. So in certain cases, this would be applicable. The SPS chapter requires both parties to follow international standards for SPS measures, the same ones that are followed by the US and China. So that could serve to reduce barriers to importing to these third-party countries importing to Mercosur, since they would be recognizing these international standards. However, this doesn't go across the board. There are other instances where we wouldn't want to apply these NTM reductions to third-party countries, such as instances where the agreement only calls for applicable changes between the EU and Mercosur. Specifically regarding SPS measures, there are provisions in the agreement that call for lists of approved exporting establishments in each of the other trade blocks to be transparent and publicized and accepted by the other trade bloc. So that is an example of something that wouldn't apply to these third-party countries. And I would love to take any questions if there are any. I have to keep it under my time limit.
Thank you, Erica. Yeah, there are a couple of questions. Maria asks regarding NTM reductions for third countries. How big could they be?
Well, I think they would be. I mean, the same logic that we use to apply the reductions to the EU would apply in those cases, except kind of at a more muted level. The instances where there are fundamental changes or shifts to harmonize NTM policies are treated in the current version of the model with the lowest NTM reductions. So they would definitely be on the lower end. I would assume under 3%. but I would also want to take a look at, what the current relationship is, so the trading relationship in those sectors between these third-party countries, and do the similar type of, research that we did for the EU and Mercosur to try to get a better idea.
Can I follow up? Yesterday, Lars Nielsen made the point that you need to read the agreement very carefully about the NTMs, and so it looks like you have read the agreement and you found places where third countries will benefit from NTM reductions, right?
Yeah, I mean, at least in the SPS chapter, there are many references to international standards and agreements that the agreement simply kind of mandates that the two follow, and establishes that agreement. Common definitions for terms. I think certain either codex classifications and things like that that international trade partners have already kind of signed on to.
I have another question. So it looks like that in your model, you identify all European Union countries and all Mercosur countries separately, but then when you present some of the results, you aggregate up to the block level. And I think for processorized, you say that there are significant European NTMs, you remove them, and processorized exports from Mercosur to the EU increase by 7%. It doesn't look to me a big increase in exports when you have significant NTMs. Is the reason that many European countries do not import processorized from Mercosur countries? It's a couple of European countries only that import rice from Mercosur. Is that the reason?
Yes, it's we're able to kind of take a deeper look because of the regional mapping that we have, and you can see that it's specifically countries like Italy and Spain that are importing these the processed rice, and I mean the EU as a whole is a net importer of rice. So yeah, there is some specific tailoring that I think needs to be done. On the EU import side, it does make more sense why the imports from Mercosur in this sector would increase, but the converse is not necessarily as realistic. So I think there's even some more tailoring of the NTM reductions that our paper could benefit from.
There is a question from Caitlin, and she's asking, have you looked at trade effects in value terms, dollars or euros?
Yes, yeah. I mean, specifically in the processed rice story, and even when looking at it in value terms, the increase in specifically Brazilian imports of rice from the major producers in the EU is pretty significant. So I mean, it is starting off from a smaller base because there wasn't as much trade to begin with in that sector, but at the same time, the increase in Mercosur imports is still larger in value terms than what you're seeing for EU imports from Mercosur. Any other questions?
Well, so How are we doing in terms of time?
We still have 4 minutes if there's
4
any other
minutes.
question.
I had a question, but I lost it. So, I mean, you've looked at the literature and what other people have found. It's a big agreement. It's a huge amount of population, but the effects you are finding for GDP and welfare are tiny.
Right. I mean, part of it, I think, is related to the fact that these simulations only account for the NTM reductions. There's not a similar treatment for tariffs and TRQs, at least at this point. But I think that will actually help moderate, hopefully help moderate some of the more unrealistic effects that we're seeing. The EU has proposed a TRQ on rice specifically that could moderate this like very large increase in Brazilian imports from the EU. So in certain ways, I think it could tamp down the estimated effects, but in other ways, I think that the tariff liberalization is pretty strong.
There are a couple of questions. Maria writes that there are some missing data on NTMs in the World Bank database. How do you deal with that? So
for some of the sectors, like I think ruminant milk, there's no data. I just ignored the ones that didn't have data, but there was some other data availability issues related to the fact that the World Bank estimates are for an older version of the GTAP sectoral breakdown. So for those instances, I think especially for rubber and plastics and the pharmaceuticals, I applied the same NTM levels that were in the database for the chemical sector, because the chemical sector was then broken up in the GTAP sector breakdown into chemicals, rubber and plastics, and pharmaceuticals. So it's definitely not a perfect application or substitution for the missing data. And ideally, based on what I've read in the literature, having unique econometric estimates of these specific NTMs, especially as they relate to the provisions that are discussed in the agreement itself, would be ideal and would be the most accurate, and something that I'm not disinterested in pursuing. So.
Great. Thank you very much, Erica. There is a question from Adwell Zebele. Please keep it for the end when we are going to have more time. Adwell, I want now to go to the second presenter today, Professor Maria Latorre from the Complutense University of Madrid will discuss her CGE analysis of the EU-Mercosur Agreement, including mileage, multinationals, and unemployment effects. Maria, the floor is yours. You are muted, Maria.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, thank you.
Do you see my screen?
Yes, I do.
Okay, let me put this a bit larger. Fine. Can you see it well?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. So, thank you very much for attending this session. And I'll present some joint work I've done with Hidemichi Yonezawa and Sorjana Oletseyuk. And it's the title is an impact assessment of the EU-Mercosur Agreement. So I cannot pass to the next slide. Okay, now I can. Okay, good. So this is the plan for the presentation. If I have to summarize our main findings, I'll just summarize them in 3 words: more value added, and you'll see why. Then I'll explain the methodology, the data, the scenarios, the results, and the conclusions. Let me put on my clock so I can see the time. Okay, so more value added. Okay, why? Well, we think this paper analyzing Mercosur adds value added compared to the previous literature along 3 main fronts. So first, about the methodology. We use CGE, which includes MELETs. It also includes FDI and it includes unemployment. Then, due to the data, we think we also add some value, even though the previous presentation also used very recent data. We use trade data in goods and services, of course, but also multinationals data and public procurement data and simulations. Thus, we also add some value regarding the simulations that we do. This screen's a bit in the middle. Okay. So regarding the simulations, let me see what happens here. Well, we do 3 types of simulations. I don't know why this is not working. Let me stop sharing the overall screen and maybe this is easier now. Just a second, some technical issues here. Okay, so regarding the simulations, we have used the negotiated chapters of the agreement to which we had access. And that implies we have included the tariffs and quotas that were negotiated. I'll tell you a bit more in a minute. Then we also were able to look at the chapters with the services offer, also the chapters related to the investment offer, and also the ones on public procurement. So regarding the methodology, of course, in the real world, we have imperfect competition, and we include MELETs in 9 manufacturing sectors. We also have multinationals, and then we include foreign direct investment in 7 service sectors, which operate in imperfect competition. This is in line with other previous analyses that my co-authors and I have done. And in the real world, and particularly because this study focuses on Spain, as you'll see in a minute, even though I'll offer also some EU results and Mercosur results, in the real world, unemployment is a big issue in Spain, and therefore we have included an unemployment wage curve at Avalanche and Oswald. So let me go deeper into our FDI story. We use a very similar approach to the one used by Balistreri et al. In the Journal of International Economics. That implies we include an Pareto distribution with the parameters that Balistreri used. As I've already said, we include MELETs in several manufacturing sectors, which cannot be taken for granted because many other CGE analyses include MELETs only in one sector, which tells you this is hard to implement. And we also include firm exit and entry, which is again an important feature of the MELETs approach that cannot be taken for granted either. Regarding the FDI, this will imply that for most of our services sectors, we have 3 types of services within each sector. For example, think about banking. We have banking services sectors produced by domestic firms and also by multinational firms producing locally. And then we also have imported varieties of banking, all of them coming from the different regions of our model. And also importantly, regarding the way we model the multinationals, there is a cost asymmetry between multinationals and domestic firms that operate in the same sector. So both type of firms are using local factors and intermediates, but the multinationals use an extra specialized foreign input that they import from abroad. And that implies when we reduce the barriers of the FDI chapters of the agreement, then the cost of the operation of multinationals goes down, and this will trigger some entry and profitability effects. Regarding the data, we split the world into 7 regions, 4 factors, and 41 sectors. The regions are Spain, the rest of the EU, not including UK, Brazil, Argentina, Paraguay, and Uruguay, and the rest of the world. And then we have 4 factors of production and 41 sectors, 8 agricultural sectors, 22 manufacturing sectors, and 11 services. We use GTAP 10, but we have updated the trading goods data using the data from the latest 3 years, 2017 till 2019, the average of those years from the International Trade Center, that is for goods trade. We include that in the model. And then we also introduce the tariffs of the latest year for 2019, which implies that Paraguay is out of the generalized system of preferences and any other changes that may have occurred. Regarding the non-tariff measures, we use the ones from the World Bank. We use for non-tariff measures in services the ones from the OECD, very recent. In some missing gaps, we have to go through the ones of the CP. And then we use the barriers for FDI from Jafari and TAR. And regarding multinational sales, because as we said, in most of the services sectors, we have firms, multinationals that are producing locally. We need to know the share in the production in that sector. Most of those sales were available in Eurostat for the Europe side of the agreement, but for Mercosur countries, this was a bit harder. We had to go through the TISMOS database from the WTO and also through the FDI markets from the Financial Times. And we have employed a lot of time to deal with the tariffs and the quotas of the agreement. As I said, we are using the latest trade data. These were many codes, more than 9,000 codes at the 8-digit level that were transformed into the GTAP 10 sectors and then into the 31 sectors of our model. But to know not only the trade, but also the tariffs and quotas, we went through those chapters of the agreement. And this was it was a bit messier because they were in a different classification. They were in HS4 instead of HS5 as the most recent trade data. So we have to convert that to the HS5 classification in order to be able to use them with our trade data. And then again to the 47 sectors and then to the 31 sectors, because I'm talking only about trading goods here. Then we also have the services sectors. So what do? We include 4 components in the agreement, and we focus, even though this is not a dynamic model, but we focus on the cumulative impact of the deepening in the reductions in tariffs and quotas and all that. So we focus on 4 main years, year 1 entry into force, then 4 years later, 10 years later, and then 15 years later, which is the year in which the final regime is reached, so to put it, and no further reductions in tariffs or quotas would be attained. And for each of those years, we include 4 components in our analysis. Then first, we have the tariffs, and which also include the quotas, but we use the term tariffs to talk about both of them. Then we have the reductions in the non-tariff measures. We assume the same reductions for all the years of the agreement. I'll go into that a bit later on. As in the previous presentation, we separate non-technical measures from SPS and TBTs, which are the main technical measures using the data from the World Bank. We believe there is more scope for liberalization in Mercosur than in the EU. I can go deeper into that if you want later on. As in the previous presentation, we have been quite conservative about these reductions. We don't reach the 20% level that I was glad to hear in the previous presentation. We don't do that either. Then for the reductions in FDI, we also assume the same reductions for the 4 years. More details if you want later on. And regarding the public procurement, we have first, and this is very important in this agreement because it really will open procurement services only for European firms at the moment. And first, it would be open at the central government agencies level. So we know in the first 2 years, year one and year 5, we include that. But then, because this could be open up to the regional level, and also, so to put it, it is possible that the agreement these NTMs may not be reached in the first year. So we also use this public procurement in the latest years of the agreement as a way to proxy that there can be a deepening in the reach of the liberalization of the agreement. So therefore, we multiply by 2 the NTMs reductions from the first 2 years in these 2 second years related to public procurement, but also to a deepening in the impact of the agreement. So let me now show to you what happens at the overall EU level, or well, I'll put all the regions first. So I'll go through the micro results. I'll focus here on year 16 to keep it manageable. So here we have the impact on GDP, private consumption, exports, imports, employment, wages, and CO2 for all the regions once all the agreement has been implemented and no further reductions are expected. As you can see here, we have a quite positive impact for all regions. So Spain, which appears in red, benefits more than the average of the EU, and Mercosur countries benefit even more, with the smaller ones, Paraguay and Uruguay, experiencing the greatest increases in their macro variables. Trade is expanded, and nicely we would create employment, we would increase wages, and yes, we would also increase CO2. But let me go deeper into the impact on CO2, because this is commonly in the press, and I think what we find here is that here I'm showing you GDP increases in year 16. It's the same data as before, but now I'm putting it closely to the CO2 impact. And as you can see, the blue bar is always larger across all regions than the gray bar, which is telling us that the agreement would imply more activity, but it would be cleaner activity, so that CO2 increases are always smaller, not only for all regions, but also for the world as a whole. GDP increases will be always larger than the CO2 emissions. Now let me go to the import side of the agreement. And here I'll show you all the imports coming from the EU. And the message is, even though we hear alarm about agriculture, bovine, and so on, the agreement is not really only about agriculture. So this is from the total increase in imports coming from the EU, to the EU. If I split that across sectors, I find that more than half of that, 57%, would take place in manufacturing sectors. So this would be more than half of manufacturing exports coming from Mercosur to the EU, and the agriculture would be 1/5. And I can go deeper into that and look at these problematic sectors. So to put it, the bovine sector would be 1/10 of trade. That's a lot, but nicely, you can find also that business services sectors, which maybe we wouldn't expect to increase to a great extent coming from Mercosur countries, is very close to that. And these are the 2 largest sectors. Overall, this would include total EU imports. I'm not talking, so this include intra-EU. It would be larger if I focus only on extra-EU trade. It's around 1.2 for extra-EU trade. So this increases the imports of the EU and also the exports of the EU. But let me go deeper into these trade impacts. Let me show you that if I focus now, as you can see here, what I'm showing the same data from a different perspective. What I'm doing is telling you this bovine problematic maybe, or I don't know, it's a hot issue in this agreement, right? So where do they come from in year 16 of the agreement? So this would not come mainly from Brazil. It's true. So these are all imports coming to the EU in year 16, right? So 16% of that would come from Brazil, but the rest of Mercosur countries would account for a larger share, and most of bovine trade would come from the EU itself. I can also have a look at the same data from services. Then in this case, it is true that Mercosur countries account for a smaller share of the overall business services, but it was important, as you remember from the other slide. Let me show this again, the same data, but from a different perspective. Now, if you look here, this is again the imports coming from the EU, but I'm adding up all sectors here so that this column, I don't know if you can see my pointer, I'm not sure whether you can see it, but if you look at the bottom of the column, what I'm showing you is the overall imports from Mercosur to the EU and how they are disaggregated across sectors. So this is from the perspective of, for example, total exports of Argentina coming to the EU. What happens there? If I focus on this sector, what I'm telling you, wow, this is a huge, important sector for Argentina, but not so much for Brazil. It is very important for Paraguay and particularly for Uruguay, okay? But if I go to service sectors and I look at this structure of exports of Mercosur countries after the agreement, I see that business services sectors, it's about 1/10, a bit smaller in Paraguay and Uruguay, of their total exports going to the EU. So this is to say that Brazil is not behind all bovine exports, as we could infer from reading the press. Now let me go deeper into the results, focusing on Spain. And now we can see how the agreement unfolds, right? We see that across these years, this is the total impact. This would have a positive and increasingly positive impact to reach around 0.27% of GDP in Spain. If you look at the details here, I'm separating the contribution of tariffs and then the non-tariff measures, which, as I explained, we suppose it's the same across years and the same for the FDI components. And these last two rows related to public procurement, this would be changed. It would be deeper in the latest 2 years. But overall, this picture is telling us that, as we could expect, because tariffs are so high before the agreement, really we find that tariffs explain most of the story related to this agreement, and they nearly account for half of the agreement. The impact of NTMs is much smaller. It's close to zero. It's not that big. But the FDI story, which has been so neglected in the previous literature reading with this agreement, is an important part of the story. It's about 1/3 of the impact. And then the public procurement, which has not received much attention either, it's also, well, it has a positive contribution. I can show you the rest of results. For many of them, go in parallel, things become increasingly positive, and tariffs are an important part of the story. Now, let me show you that for the Spanish economy, this would result, again, back to year 16 to show you the overall picture. This would result in an increase in production, employment, wages, exports, imports, and prices, despite this expansionary tendency, will keep low because agriculture will be cheaper. But what I want to show you here is that this increase in production somehow underestimates the overall impact of the agreement, because if you remember, in terms of value added, it is much larger. It's about 0.27%. We find that it would be close to compensating the impact on Brexit in Spain, which we have also looked at in the past. So this agreement implies more value added. So to conclude.
You have 2 more minutes.
Thank you very much. Even though I was not able to show you in detail the results, what we find is that all the signatories are turning their exports, and therefore, when you add up also the FDI story, their production structure into a more value, a structure that is based more on more value-added sectors. So most of the activity, if you remember the HSC system, if you go to the bottom and, well, somehow increasing the numbering of the sectors, if you reach 99, usually you are turning from more raw sectors, less sophisticated sector into more sophisticated sectors. And that's what we find across all countries. And this is really nice because you find that the value chains among the signatories become stronger and that all of them are turning into sectors that add more value. So we find this is a win-win. Everybody wins in these results. It encourages, the agreement encourages specialization in cleaner sectors because as we've seen, CO2 emissions growth, they increase, they go up, but it's lower their increase than the GDP growth. We have found that this agreement is not only about agriculture, it involves many more sectors and agriculture is just a part of the agreement. I haven't have time to go through that, but I feel this agreement plays a strategic role in the face of China's rise. I have some data on that. You want to talk about it a little bit? We find that nicely using a CGE, you are able to estimate that it results also in wage improvements, in a higher remuneration for companies while keeping inflation low. And it is a source of growth and job creation, and therefore it helps to fight against inequality and reduces poverty. So thank you very much. Let me just briefly show you, since I think I still have some seconds, that we've done also some analysis on the impact on e-commerce. We find just the announcement of the agreement would increase e-commerce. I haven't had time to go through that, but between 4.7 and to 10%, depending on how you measure that. And I could give you more detail on how, not only through a CGE, but also using this atlas of complexity methodologies, we also estimate that it turns trade into a trade that is more specialized in complex products. So thank you very much. That's all on my side.
Thank you very much, Maria. We have some time now, 10 minutes for questions, comments. I have a question about your calculations about CO2 emissions. Are your coefficients, your emission coefficients attached to the output level or to the intermediate input used to produce something?
To both of them. So we measure, I don't know if Hidemichi is around, he could talk a bit more about this, but we measure all production across sectors, but that takes into account production going to other sectors. So I would say that it includes both intermediates and the use of intermediates or the use of production for other uses different than intermediates. We look at the impact of CO2 emissions across all sectors. So I would say it includes both. Marinos.
Okay, so it's well, I'm thinking you have economies of scale there. So it is possible to produce more with less inputs and cut your emissions if they come from your input use.
Mm-hmm.
Or you have a sectoral composition effect and you produce more of the cleaner sectors.
So we see that really the emissions are mostly concentrated, to our surprise, in I mean, at least to mine, in services sectors in Europe, and also in private consumption patterns, which I forgot to mention, but we also measure the CO2 emissions attached to consumption. So it turns out that agriculture only accounts for a very small share of the CO2 emissions, and most of it happens in the services sectors, electricity, transport sectors, and also I think it was because I didn't put that here, but we did calculate it across all regions, and overall, for the world total, around close to 1/3, I don't think it reaches the 1/3, but it around 1/3, not reaching that, it's related to private consumption patterns across the regions.
Okay, thank you, Maria. Elliot has a question about the NTM's database estimation methods. Did you focus on the World Bank data, or did you look at other databases about NTMs?
We did look at other databases, but in the end turned back to the World Bank, because for goods, I think that is the best that is available. If you know of other sources that could be better, please let us know, because it's really it works at the bilateral level. It's really nice. Then you have the four Mercosur countries separated, also Spain. No, sorry, for EU it's a block, so it's the same across sectors. But at least for the four Mercosur countries, it works at the bilateral level, which is nice. There were some gaps there, but fortunately, most of them were for Paraguay, which is the smallest country in the agreement. So we tried to solve that. And what is missing there is the NTMs for services sectors. So for that, you know, this database that is so recent from the OECD, we use most of the data from that database, but there were a couple of sectors that they do not cover. So we went to this about the FDI NTMs. Those come from this database that was released from the World Bank. So we use that for the data of NTMs for FDI. And I think we have been carefully looking for the best data sources. If you know about others, I cannot see the chats at the moment. I don't know if you're writing anything else, but I think that is the best that is available from the best of our knowledge.
Okay, thank you, Maria. I mean, Elliot may send you more information.
Well, that's nice. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Going, you know, I'm monitoring the chat box. Going back to the carbon dioxide emissions, you say they increase, but GDP increases faster, but they still increase. So are they members of the Paris Agreement? Yes. And what are they doing regarding their commitments?
So I think really the Mercosur agreements sort of reinforces their legally commitments to the Paris Agreement. So all of them are signatories. So what they are doing so far, I don't know. I haven't gone through that. But we know they have this commitment, and really the text that we have been reading about the agreement, what we have available from the text from the European Commission website and other sources, this would certainly result in an increased commitment, I would say, because there are mechanisms that can be put at place. Civil society is able to, you know, jump in and, you know, accuse if something is not being respected. I think that the agreement does a job regarding a reinforcement of the commitments of the Paris agreements through different tools.
Okay, all right, thank you. Elliot wrote, well, I'm going to read it. So Elliot, do the two services NTM sources seem comparable in terms of size of NTMs? I cannot quite remember both methodologies, but I think they take different approaches.
Well, that's a good point. I think the OECD does I think both of them do the best that we know we could do with the data that we have. Of course, you are mixing sources, and that it's always a little bit of a danger, but we have no other alternative for services. And neither, well, for goods, there are more alternatives, but I think the data set from the World Bank is the more complete. The good thing about the OECD is that it's very updated, because the data that we've used are for 2019. So probably it's not the best idea to mix sources, but if there are no, you know, if one only covers services and the other one only goods, there's no way around that. So.
All right, thank you, Maria. Now, you at the end, you mentioned inequality and distributional issues. Are you extrapolating from your aggregate results, or you looked?
No. Oh, sorry, Marinos, go on.
Or are you linking your results to any surveys of income distributions, consumption, that sort of thing?
No, that's really nice. But what I'm, if all of the regions increase employment and wages, I think we can say that this will be positive. But we haven't done any. We haven't. In reality, this has been done in a few months. So there are ways to improve it for sure. We haven't used any survey data or to look to do a more tailored analysis to distributional issues. No, that's not included. It's just that because we see employment and wages increases across all signatories, then we can expect that overall, at least, this is a good sign.
Okay, I'm still monitoring the chat box. Well, here in the US, there is a lot of interest in trade and labor and distributional issues. So, I mean, we try to break the labor markets to more than 5 segments, and so I don't know if you have the data. You could link your macro results to more disaggregate outcomes. And we do find, I mean, when, for example, we break the US labor markets to more segments, we find different effects for different labor markets. The average is something like you might get from the CGE model, but you find that there are heterogeneity in the outcomes by labor segment.
No, that's certainly very interesting and a way to work deeper on this in the future. No, I think those results, in the end, the economy is for people, so we want to make people better off. Absolutely. The thing is that really coming to these estimations on how tariffs would behave, or quotas, or the FDI story, or think about the procurement, that really has taken months of work, because we have gone through all the codes to convert that into the more aggregate level of the CGE. So that has been quite time consuming. I think other things can be done, but at least when we say that tariffs are the most important component, then we know we have been quite careful about how tariffs behave. So then I think at least we can be sure that the tariffs story is nice and is well grounded, because we have gone through the codes of all the HS8 sectors and translated that into GTAP sectors.
We're out of time. We should move on to the next.
Sure, absolutely. Thank you, Maria, very much.
Thank you very much. Let me stop sharing.
Okay, so we are going to move now to our discussant, Caitlin Carico from Wageningen Economic Research at The Hague in the Netherlands. It's going to discuss this session. We have 30 minutes, Caitlin. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. So I'm just going to share my presentation. Go. I think it's sharing now. Okay, so I think that you can see that. So,
Yes.
Yes. Okay. Good. Very good. Thank you, Marina. So for the introduction, as Marina mentioned, I'm going to discuss the session and looking sort of at a broad picture on assessing the economic effects of the EU and the US. Don't know why that's not. So there we go. Okay, so just again a bit of a background, which we've heard a few times now. The EU-Mercosur Agreement was sort of in these on and off negotiations for over 20 years. and it represents important opportunities for liberalization to be implemented over a 15-year time period in different steps. And it also includes many provisions intended to facilitate market access, addressing sanitary and phytosanitary standards, as well as technical barriers to trade, and a host of other provisions as well, affecting the services sectors, for example. Originally there were 3 papers to be presented in the session, so I still have the 3 of them here. And unfortunately, we couldn't hear about the first paper. But we have heard about the second paper. So it's an interesting variety of papers, looking at sort of different effects, looking at effects on sort of third parties, including the US, and also looking at effects on the EU economy and especially on Spain, and looking at sort of using a variety of different tools in terms of how we're doing this analysis, how the agreement is being assessed. So I will still talk about the first paper. So I understand this is also work in progress, even though this unfortunately, again, wasn't able to be presented today. It's still an interesting work in progress, and I look forward to seeing the continued progression in a new draft. So this was a this is a paper which is focusing on implications for U.S. exports and market shares. So it's really looking at the U.S. as a competitor with Mercosur on the EU market. And the focus of this paper is really looking at agri-food trade. And I thought this was a really nice contribution, looking at all these very quite specific agri-food sectors, according to the GTAP specifications, of course, the GTAP commodities. And what they found is that with the implementation of the agreement, the U.S. is exporting less fruit and vegetables, less bovine meat, and less processed food to the U.S. And naturally, these are all commodities where Mercosur EU trade is expanding. So there's really, it's indicative of sort of a preference shift in terms of EU imports. And this is quite natural because, especially considering a tariff liberalization, then it means that Mercosur imports are relatively cheaper than they had been, and in comparison with the US imports. So this is why the EU starts to prefer the Mercosur imports. Okay, so this is sort of a general overview of this first paper. And again, it really focuses on the agri-food sectors. And I think that's quite a nice contribution. So the second paper, which was presented, or the first paper, if you have been listening to these presentations today, this is again looking at effects for the US. So they started this paper with a nice overview of trade statistics and also the relevant literature. And so they find that there's currently extensive trade in certain products, chemicals, machinery, pharmaceuticals, from EU to Mercosur, and agri-food from Mercosur to the EU. And they find in the literature that there's expected gains from tariff liberalization and TRQs, and that these gains are are seen to be relatively more for Mercosur, so far in the literature. In terms of methodology, they're using GTAP version 7, 2017 baseline. And they're looking at the individual EU countries as well as the Mercosur countries. And they do a tariff reduction based on the market access schedules. But the focus of this paper is really the AMS shocks, so the productivity shocks that they're doing based on changes to NTMs. So they get this NTM data from the World Bank, and they separate out technical and non-technical NTMs. And they look at 8% reduction in NTMs for technical NTMs and 17% for non-technical. So they've really done quite a bit of work to make sure that these NTMs are as tailored as possible and in accordance with the provisions as they are available. So what they find is that they do find sort of these small gains for the EU and for Mercosur. And they also find this trade diversion effects, which implies small losses for the US and China, as trade that was originally between Mercosur or the EU and US and China is now more focused within the EU and Mercosur market. So in terms of the benefits, the largest benefits for Mercosur and for the EU, find the largest benefits are for Brazil and Argentina. From the EU, the very largest were for Germany, and also they have sizable results for France, Spain, Italy, and the Netherlands. So one of the main conclusions which they really found is that the most benefiting sectors, so the sectors which face the highest, which receive the highest benefits, are those that initially face the highest NTMs. And this is also the sectors where there's significant trade diversion. So this is really sort of the highlight of the work, is looking at these NTMs, what are the effects of these NTMs, and what are the causes on important third-party markets, such as the US and China. And I really look forward, as I think there's quite some discussion on this future proposed research on looking at third country benefits of these NTM changes that might come out of this agreement. So that I thought was will be a quite an important contribution as well. So the next paper which we heard about, so this is the most recent one, is Maria's paper looking at the EU-Mercosur Agreement, looking at the effects especially for the EU and specifically for Spain. And this is a really very detailed paper, very interesting paper with a variety of sort of non-standard theoretical elements, which Maria has really emphasized and shown the value added of these different elements. So she's implementing mellets for manufacturing, FDI for services, and also unemployment. She's also, there's also a lot of sort of data work which has gone into this, updating GTAP trade and tariff statistics with RTC statistics. Also, she also looks at NTMs from the World Bank and OECD, and getting FDI specific information as well. So she looked at 4 different time periods. So a lot of the analysis was focused on sort of the final implementation after 15 years, so in year 16. And She also, again, looks at tariffs, NTMs, FDI, and also public procurement. So it's very extensive and very extensive sort of analysis in terms of what's captured in the methodology. In terms of macro results, there are overwhelmingly positive gains. So in terms of GDP, in terms of trade, in terms of labor markets, and very importantly, especially considering Spain, Spain was found to gain more than the EU average. A really nice element to this paper is that they're also looking at the emissions impact. So for me, I thought this was very interesting, looking at how even though there's GDP growth, relatively the emissions are growing less. So they found this to be evidence of cleaner activity. Also, the sectoral results were quite interesting. So looking at the fact that, well, first, primarily the fact that while agriculture is a big story, in fact, proportionately manufacturing is sort of the most important in terms of trade. But if we look at agriculture, when you look at bovine trade, it's not really all about Brazil. So there's a broader story there too. And in terms of the impacts on Spain, Maria actually found that the largest gains were from tariffs. So this was quite interesting. And there's also important gains from FDI. So I thought that the fact that the largest gains were from tariffs was very interesting, especially considering that often NTM impacts can be significant. Say, of course, this certainly has to do with how NTMs are being modeled. And I think more and more we are tailoring how we're modeling NTMs compared with, maybe 5 or 10 years ago, how NTMs were being modeled. So I think that perhaps this could also account for that. But I think that's a really important result. And I thought this was interesting, the issue of accounting for e-commerce. So if I understood correctly, it's not quite in the modeling yet, but it's something which maybe could be added in the future. And I do think that especially now when we think about the digital economy and increasing digitalization, this would be really also another value added. Okay, so I'm actually also going to discuss some of my own work on the EU-Mercosur. So actually in the first presentation today, this was also touched upon a bit. And I will just discuss this, and then I'll come back to sort of all the papers and kind of offer some general thoughts and reflections and general conclusions. So this is a report which I worked on with my colleagues, Simon van Berkom, Andre Tabot, and Jacob Jaeger, as well as Nora Plazia from Ocores. So there was a parliamentary motion in 2019 to assess the EU-Mercosur Agreement for the Dutch Parliament. And in particular, the request was to focus on the agricultural sectors. So we were assigned this report by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Ministry of Agriculture, and the Ministry of Economic Affairs. And we did our modeling based on the at the time, what were the most recent negotiated market access schedules? And something that I think is a bit relevant to all of the papers, and I don't know how much it was highlighted so far, it's just in terms of, what is the relative size of trade between these sort of economic blocks? Because we talk about a lot about, okay, so this is very important, the trade agreement in terms of the sort of economic coverage when we think about how large are the economies of the EU and Mercosur, and also when we think about the relative populations that are also covered, which is very important. It's an important consideration, especially as Maria was mentioning earlier, when we think about the economy, we also want to think about, well, the workers, because this is the point. Who's benefiting from the economy? It's the employees, it's the workers. But at the same time, when we've heard a lot today in today's session that there's relatively muted effects, and we can think about, well, why is this? Well, if we actually look at the current trade flows, they're relatively small. So here again, this paper is predominantly on the Netherlands, but it's also we also looked at the EU-27 as well. And if we look at the share of exports to Mercosur in non-EU exports, or we can look the same for the imports, the share of trade is about 2%. It's a little bit higher for the Netherlands, but it's about 2% of total extra EU trade. So that means that it's an important agreement, but currently the trade flows are relatively small. So this explains a bit some of the muted effects that we see in terms of GDP. Okay. So I won't talk about this too much. So actually, Erica had presented this table before. And so overall, it's just showing that Mercosur countries tend to have higher tariffs that they're applying. So the EU is typically facing higher tariffs in its trade with Mercosur relative to the tariffs that Mercosur countries are facing when they're exporting to the EU. So then we anticipate that Mercosur countries can benefit in a sense, or EU exporters will benefit in the sense that they will face much lower tariff relatively after the reduction, but Mercosur importers then can also benefit in that same sense. And then this is just to sort of show the current TRQ regimes that EU has with Mercosur countries. So actually, the point is that actually, so there's quite a few different TRQ regimes, and they're rather complicated, and they're for different products. So quite a few for beef, and especially for poultry. But a big takeaway point from this is that especially for beef, the import volumes are consistently exceeding the TRQs. So the TRQs are fully utilized, and there's quite a bit of demand in the EU for these products. Okay, so when we think about that, and then we look at the future TRQs to be implemented in the EU-Mercosur trade agreement, essentially this means that there's going to be expansion for beef, poultry, and sugar. But this expansion is, in fact, expected to really be important, especially for beef, considering that the TRQ is currently fully utilized. So there will really be a benefit for expanding that TRQ. There are new TRQs also for pork, ethanol, rice, honey, sweet corn, and dairy. Okay. So in our report, we use the magnet model. So this is our in-house model that we've developed. And we use a dynamic model, though we just look at the difference between 2020 and 2035 when we assumed full liberalization. And we also use the 8-digit market access schedule for the EU-27 and the 4 Mercosur countries. And we use this to calculate the country product specific tariff shocks. We also modeled TRQs specifically, and we looked at price effects and quantity effects. So price effects being changes to the in-quota tariff rate, and quantity effects being changes to the quota level. We also modeled NTMs, and we used our results from the World Bank for goods, and we sort of used a combination of World Bank and OECD estimates for trade and services. Okay, so overall, we found very muted macroeconomic results in terms of GDP for both the Netherlands and for the rest of the EU-27. Mercosur benefits a bit more, though it's still less than 1%. So this has to do a bit for the Netherlands. Here I'm showing the sectoral output composition. So for the Netherlands, it has to do quite a bit with the importance of the sort of the economic shocks. A lot of this is coming from the tariff reductions, which affects manufacturing and agri-food sectors. However, largely the Netherlands is a services economy. And for the EU, it actually looks like a similar picture. So the EU, it's quite similar. It's largely a services-driven economy, whereas the important tariff shocks are therefore only affecting a minority of the producers in the whole economy. So this explains a bit the muted output also. Now, here I'm going to show the trade exposure to Mercosur. So this is something else which explains more of our sectoral results, which we'll look at next. So for trade exposure, essentially we consider the value of the trade flow to the total value of the output for that sector. And we look at it for both imports and exports. So overall, we can see that agri-food sectors face higher import exposure, which means import competition, and manufacturing services face higher levels of export exposure, which is basically opportunities for market expansion in the foreign markets. So here, when we look at production growth as a result of the agreement for the Netherlands, indeed we see, that the sectors which initially had higher export exposure or import exposure, are negatively impacted. And this is agri-food sectors, especially beef and cattle. And the sectors which had higher export exposure indeed expanded. They took the opportunities on the export market, and their production expanded. And that's what we see for pharmaceuticals and machinery. In our model, this translates directly to the real wage bill, the employment effects. We have constant labor productivity, and so this is why. And essentially, we see that the contracting sectors in terms of production face a reduced real wage bill, and the expanding sectors benefit from an increased real wage bill. We looked in particular at the export growth, and we looked at this in the report in terms of percent change, but also in terms of million euros. And we present it in terms of million euros because if we're just looking at the percent changes, sometimes it looks like, there's really important changes for sectors that aren't actually that important when we convert it to the growth in terms of million euros. And overall, there's the highest levels of export growth, again, for the machinery and pharmaceuticals. So these were the sectors which had initially the highest levels of export exposure. And there was some limited growth for dairy. In terms of import growth, again, looking at this in terms of million euros, the highest levels were for fruits and vegetables, chemicals, and heavy manufacturing. We also looked at this in terms of sort of the sectoral trade balance. So this was something that we also found especially useful in terms of sort of contextualizing the results which we had for agriculture and in relation to sort of overall economy results. So overall, so here we're only showing a portion of the sectors that we looked at. Yet overall, there was a positive change in the trade balance. And here we see that there was really the highest overall growth, again, for the manufacturing sectors. And that there was some sort of losses for the agri-food sectors.
You have 2 more minutes, Caitlin.
Okay, thank you. So I think I will skip that and just go directly to some considerations that we had. And basically, we're abstracting away from a certain level of detail when we're looking at sort of these GTAP sectors. And when we start thinking about import competition or even opportunities for export expansion, we can start thinking about, well, how realistic is this? So for example, in the Netherlands, if you actually look into the trade data, the Netherlands is importing citrus fruit, whereas in the Netherlands, we're producing apples and pears. So in the model, it's showing this as import competition, and this is driving some of the results. However, in reality, this may not be the case. So we can interpret this in a certain way, but we also have to think a little bit more about this critically. And I think that this is also true for all the papers that were presented today. Just to go back to some general overview. Across the papers, we've been looking at tariff reduction and also NTMs. In Maria's paper, she additionally looked at FDI, and she additionally considered mellets and certain labor market changes such as unemployment, whereas the other papers were looking at perfect competition. In terms of macroeconomic results, there was also differences. So for example, in Maria's paper, she had relatively larger effects. And I think maybe this is something that we can discuss, because in her paper, she also mentioned that she did some maybe sensitivity analysis and also looked at perfect competition. And so actually she found that she got a little bit of higher effects or higher gains from the use of melites. I don't know if that also includes the FDI as well, but I think Maria can talk about that more in the discussion. And also in terms of the US effects, there were important sort of sectoral effects for the US. And kind of just briefly, a couple points for discussion. So as I mentioned before, I think an important point which we can reflect on more is the EU-Mercosur Agreement has important geographic and socioeconomic coverage. They're given sort of the limited trade flows that exist now, and the fact that especially in certain ways that we're modeling this agreement, are we really capturing the full benefit? Can we think that there's going to be non-zero trade in the future where we have zero trade today? And also, when we think about fulfilling the full potential of the agreement, this depends on several factors. So the alignment of standards, I think this was sort of touched on a bit. I think a lot of people are concerned with this, especially when we're thinking about making sure that we model most accurately as possible the NTMs, and also trade facilitation. Now, in terms of questions for modeling the agreement, so one point which I also made and discussing my own paper with my colleagues is that when we're looking at the aggregate level, we really have to think at these aggregate categories. Are they really fully capturing competition? And this is important when we're thinking about import competition within the EU, import competition from the Mercosur countries. But for those papers that are looking at sort of US as a competitor with Mercosur entering the EU market, then we also have to ask the same question there. Are we, is there really competition in what's being produced in the US and what's being produced in the Mercosur countries, even if it's in these broad categories at the HS level, for example? Are these really sort of substitutable products which are being traded? The other
I think we should move on to the questions, and I think this is the best moment to do it.
Okay, if I can just finish, because I think these actually are questions which are for the discussion. Thank you. So the other point, which is really important, is what are the best theoretical assumptions which we should be using? And I think this, Maria, I hope she can talk a little bit more about that. Because there are real differences, especially in the modeling results, if we're using perfect competition, or as Maria implemented sort of this suite of different theoretical assumptions. And then we can also think there's a lot of other provisions that maybe we haven't touched on, services provisions. So maybe Maria's paper touches on this a bit, considering FDI. And then, of course, coming back to how much media focus there has been on the environmental and social impacts, and we have to consider, are we really capturing this in the modeling as well? So now I think we have a time for discussion.
Thank you very much, Kathleen. That was a very nice discussion, and we got a bonus exercise from you and your colleagues. We have, because we lost the first presenter, Constanza Valdez was not able to present today. We have some time. The program usually does not factor in discussion after the discussion, but we have time. So maybe Erica or Maria have some comments here, and I monitor the chat box. So Erica?
Yeah, I did want to address the one question from earlier before Maria went into her presentation from Adwell Zambele. Did you also consider NTMs in relation to exports, or are they only in relation to imports? And in the current specification of the model, they're pretty much just like applied to imports, but that's one of the major kind of lines of future work that I want to incorporate. I think one of the papers that was presented yesterday, and there's a decent amount of other papers existing in literature that find a way to apportion shares of the overall NTM ad valorem equivalent to these different methods of implementing NTMs. So there are some that you could apportion a share of the AB to an export tax, which would be maybe more applicable given the nature of that NTM that you're talking about. So it's not something that I do currently, but it's something that I want to implement in the paper.
Thank you, Erica. Maria?
Thank you. So yes, I wanted to thank Erika and Kathleen for her very detailed review on the papers. For me, it has been very helpful and nice to get this overview. I want to put on the table two aspects that were raised by Kathleen, and Erika was just talking about them. So one of them is on the NTMs again, because I think well, there are a lot of very experienced people in the audience. So we have Marinos, who has seen so many agreements. David Tarr, Sherman was there. I think maybe he's still there. I think this is the part in which we know less, right? Because as it came up also in the debate yesterday, because really what the percentage reduction should be for an NTM is a very hard task, right? I'm wondering that maybe we get, in some of the cases, results that are not so impactful, you know, very a small impact, maybe because we are very conservative about the NTMs. But I wanted to put this point on the table because I myself have been conservative, and I saw Erika was pointing out no more than 20%. I'm wondering what happens in the real world when we see these agreements. And this is also related to my second point. My second point would be on the shares that Kathleen was highlighting. It's true that Europe currently conducts a very small share of trade with Mercosur countries. I'm wondering here, again, because of the type of methodology we use, we are somehow stuck in grasping that once you get rid of any obstacles, because we are applying the reductions in NTMs and tariffs to a very tiny share of trade, and then our results are small, right? But these agreements, I don't know if with Latin American countries, maybe the story is a bit more complicated because the obstacles are not we don't get rid of them so easily. It's another point I would want to point out, in the sense that I think Latin American countries are very protectionist, maybe more than other areas in the world. I wanted to discuss a little bit about that, because to get maybe a sense of the people who know a lot about this in the room. But I think maybe also our models have a difficulty in grasping the potential of the agreement, because really the obstacles are removed for a tiny share of trade. I don't know. What do you think?
If I can just comment on that too. So I didn't present this here because actually our report was contained other parts too. So in part of the report we actually had, so this is something more my colleague was doing, but we also did sort of stakeholder interviews as well. And so we were talking with firms who are currently trading with Dutch firms, which are currently trading with Mercosur countries, for example, or they have a presence there in Mercosur countries. And yeah, what they saw is that, you know, some of the biggest barriers are really what we're capturing in NTMs, and that's actually a barrier to entry. So I think it kind of goes to your 2 points, because first, it's they found that the market is very protectionist, so it's very difficult to enter, and even once you're there, it's also hard to survive. But also, there's also a lot of problem in terms of trade facilitation. So even if you're doing all the right paperwork, often like SPS paperwork, it can just be sort of sitting on someone's desk for a long time, like maybe years. And so whether you consider, is this protectionism or is this, you know, inefficiency, it can be a little bit difficult to parse out. But basically, first, it seems there is protectionism, and whether it's protectionism or inefficiencies or lack of sort of correspondence in sort of how these SPS measures exist between the EU market and the Mercosur market. Regardless, these NTMs are important, and if we remove them, it does seem that there will be opportunities for firms to enter, and it could very well be in what you were saying, Maria, in sectors that aren't currently trading. So those are zero trade flows, and as you said, if we're only looking at what is being traded and really changes on what's being traded, it's so hard to identify, you know, what new trade could come in the future. So, I mean, I guess that's to say that probably our results are really a lower bound of the possibility that the agreement has.
I was curious also, thank you, Kathleen, on how did the parliament take your results? Because there are a lot of political issues surrounding this agreement also, right?
Yeah, so well, there's two things. So first, I thought it's a bit of a tricky situation in the Netherlands right now because there's there was elections, and very recently this spring there's been elections, and there's a big scandal with the prime minister. So right now there's still at the tail ends of working on the new government formation. So all of this has kind of, I think, combined with COVID, it's kind of been more, more the center of focus. So they had actually, it was very interesting because the parliament had actually voted even, so first they issued the motion in 2019 that they wanted this study, and then last year they actually voted, they pushed another motion that they were asking the government to vote against the Mercosur Agreement, but for animal welfare issues. And the government said, okay, we're not giving you any answer. We're waiting for the analysis to come out. And but now with the new government formation process, the government still hasn't given its response yet. So that's a bit of the story here.
So I have a comment if on some of these issues, if I may.
Yes, please go ahead, David.
Yeah, so I guess I'd be cautious in saying that our models are systematically underestimating these things. I think it's a question of, I think this comment came up in the Mercosur section yesterday. What do these agreements entail? So, I mean, if to begin with, there's supposed to be harmonization, but then on the standards, I mean, we know that, to back up a second, we know that non-tariff barriers these days are primarily in the area of standards and technical regulations. That's the the work that's been done by I think Gordon and his colleagues and others as well. So and on that issue, then harmonization moves a long way toward removing those, but it's insufficient on its, and that does a lot, but it's insufficient by itself. If countries don't accept certificates of conformity, actually, so you have a Dutch firm which produces according to the standard now accepted in Mercosur and ships a product to Brazil, and then the question, but then do the authorities in Brazil accept the certificate that says it conforms with standards in Brazil? So the certificates are virtually as important, or without the mutual acceptance of these certificates of conformity, which doesn't always come in these agreements. You have the problem that Caitlin was referring to, that the goods can approval of the imports can take a long time and be a real barrier. So I do models similar to the ones that Marie is doing here, and usually people criticize me for being estimating gains which are too large. So I wouldn't want to say that these models necessarily always underestimate. And so there are as far as the low trade is concerned, I mean and there is the fundamental issue of distance. Of course, you have water transportation, which should minimize that, but say to Paraguay, you'd certainly have considerable costs of transportation, and there are natural trade barriers that these agreements are not going to eliminate. And so, I mean, I think, for example, if you have, Central Asian countries trading with, you can have great trade agreements with Central Asian countries, but you're not going to eliminate these natural trade barriers that's going to make trade very low, and so you would get low gains in any such assessment. So anyway, it's a difficult problem to sort these all out. I think what we concluded yesterday was, I forget who it was that made the comment, that what we need to do is look into detail in some of these agreements to see just what's agreed and how likely it is that these will be implemented. And by that, we can look at other agreements to see to what extent did other agreements succeed in lowering some of these non-tariff barriers. But anyway, bottom line, I'm cautious on saying these are underestimates, and there are, and just one final comment, there are ways to model trade facilitation as well, separate from the non-tariff barriers, following the work of David Hummels and his colleague. So people are doing that as well now, separate from the non-tariff barriers.
Thank you, David. Sermon Robinson has a comment question. He's asking, does this discussion argue for a more detailed sectoral analysis, perhaps in a partial equilibrium framework, but focusing on imperfect competition and the role of trade as a pro-competitive policy? Sermon, do you want to?
Sure. Let me make a point here. Maria and others have raised the issue that you may have areas where you're going to create trade where no trade. But I kept thinking about the UK and EU disagreements about Northern Ireland. on standards on sausages. My memory back when the UK joined the EU is that they had a big fight about harmonizing standards. And again, the UK wanted to have a cross agreement that our standards were fine. And there was one fight, for example, about sausages. The EU had a standard that said a sausage had to have a certain percentage of meat in it. And the UK had sausages that had no meat whatsoever. It was just filler plus grease. So, and that was a big issue back then. So I think there is an argument. Plus, this focus on aggregates these are very small shares of EU trade. You're going to get small numbers. But as Maria carefully pointed out, and which is extremely useful, is this detailed sectoral stuff really does make a difference. Those are the people that are going to complain in the parliaments. And you really want to focus on that. So I can see an argument both ways. And I did say imperfect competition models work just fine in a partial equilibrium framework. And if you think that's where we're getting a big gain, then let's focus on those.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, just to tell you what's happening in the US ITC in that area. When we get a request to do one of these big agreement studies, we do a scoping exercise. What are the interesting topics, sectors, etc. And if the general equilibrium framework does not address these specific interests, we do a lot of partial equilibrium analysis. And in the end, the general equilibrium model is like of a synthesis tool to pull all of these information together and produce, the higher level analysis. So, and at the partial equilibrium analysis level, you have much more flexibility in terms of, data modeling. Caitlin?
Yes, thank you. So something that has there's partial equilibrium. That's one way to get more detail. But also GTAP has the GTAP HS model, which I think right now, have you used that at the USITC? So we have here, we've developed a version for the magnet model. So we've developed a HS module based on the GTAP HS model. So that's something that I presented yesterday, actually. And so we recently used that to do an analysis of the African continental free trade area. And it's there we were breaking out the fruit and vegetable sector. And, so we break out that aggregate sector into the 105 HS6 codes, which are underlying it. And then you start getting really different results. Actually, we got more muted results in terms of GDP and also in terms of trade flows. But this is for a variety of reasons, because when you're looking at these particular, when you have sourcing, not between this aggregate commodity, but or at the aggregate commodity level, but rather at these much smaller 105 detailed sectors, then you sort of introduce an element of restriction into the model just because it's more specific. The trade structure is more specific. So you don't have you no longer have substitutability between literally apples and oranges, whereas that's what we're assuming when we have sort of one aggregate category. But it's very interesting. So it definitely changes the result. Of course, you have to say the theory is a bit different in that model. So you have besides the theoretical structure, of trade, having that HS6 level sourcing, you also have a super agent. So you have homogeneous prices across importing agents. But it's interesting to see the more detailed results. So I don't know if anyone else has experience. I don't know if you're also using it at the USIGC. But that's something that we've started using, and it's not quite PE. It's still the GE framework, but it offers this additional level of detail. Not sure if anyone else has experience with that.
Thank you, Kathleen.
May
Maria?
I, Marinos?
Yes.
So thank you for these inputs on partial equilibrium and also on this extension of the GTAP HS model. I find that very interesting. I think we still haven't seen many papers on that, so I'll have a look at yours, Kathleen. I think Janine Pelican presented something last year, right? I was interested in that, so I'll have a look. Thank you. Let me just put another result on the table because Kathleen mentioned it, that we do the sensitivity analysis, and if you remember, hard to remember probably, but the Spanish impact on GDP of Mercosur is 0.27 once we have the FDI story and the Melitz story. If we take out the Melitz story, from 0.27, it goes down to 0.11. And if we further do not take into account multinationals' activity, it goes to 0.08 GDP. This 0.08 is very much in line with the estimations of Sinabel and Grubel, which ran a new quantitative trade model and disaggregated Spain because they covered many European countries separately. And it's also very close to the new quantitative trade model that the Bank of Spain uses to estimate the EU-Mercosur Agreement. In these two models, when we turn to the new quantitative trade model world, so to put it, they focus on goods. So there is no story at all about services, which I think it's important in today's world, right? It's not the most important in trade, but it's an important element. But I have seen this for the results of Mercosur, and I have also seen this for the results of Brexit that we did a year ago. Once we took out the Melitz implementation and the FDI story, our results for Brexit, again compared to new quantitative trade models either from the Bank of Spain or other sources, were very much aligned, which I have always found very interesting. It's true that it is very aggregate and, it's a rough aggregation, right? But I thought that was really interesting. Just if it helps in this debate on underestimation or not, that David was saying, I don't think we are underestimating. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Maria.
I mean, it's certainly true that if you include imperfect competition, you include FDI, you're going to get much bigger results as a rule, especially if you look at if you have estimates of the non-tariff, of the ad valorem equivalence of the barriers to FDI, include that in your model. We usually get that as the dominant aspect in their results. Not always. We just did a model where it was not the dominant one for Ukraine-Turkey agreement, but generally you get barriers to FDI dominating when you liberalize those in terms of the welfare results.
Thank you, David. And I think that was you began this literature with the FDI. Remember, with this paper on Russia and the Russia accession to the WTO. And because you raised, you put on the table these FDI effects, then the story was much more, much bigger impact. I think that is an important part of all these complex agreements that we have now. Trade agreements are not only tariffs right now. So.
Yeah, I should say we've only been doing it on services because generally we don't negotiate FDI barriers in goods. Yeah, but yeah, what you said is right.
Well, we are approaching the end of the original session. I want to thank Alfredo for hosting this session today. I want to thank Erika Bethman, Maria Latorre, Kathleen Carico for presenting and discussing their work. I want to thank all the participants. I think we had a very interesting, insightful discussion today. Maybe we can finish the session. If there is no more, maybe we can finish. What do you think, Alfredo?
Yeah, I think at 8:12 is like supposed to end.
Yeah, and I know Maria needs to go somewhere. So, well, great. I enjoyed this session very much. Thank you all very much, and enjoy the rest of the conference.